Political news tonight, particularly on MPs' outside interest. You may want to ask on that, or indeed anything else. The lines are open now. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, a member of the government's top team says he regrets the way ministers handled a vote on Owen Paterson's conduct last week. A report found the former Conservative MP broke lobbying rules, but the party chose not to suspend him. They wanted to instead review parliamentary standards, but plans were then withdrawn following a backlash. Minister Stephen Barclay has called it a mistake.
I would like first and foremost to express my regret and that of my ministerial colleagues over the mistake made last week. The manner in which the government approached last week's debate conflated them with the response to an individual case.
The new chairman of Yorkshire County Cricket Club says seismic change is needed following racism and bullying allegations. No disciplinary action was taken after a report found Asim Rafiq had been targeted. Lord Patel has apologised to him and his family. Chelsea's match against Liverpool in January will be the first top-flight game to have standing fans for more than 25 years. 5 clubs in total will trial safe standing zones. The LBC Markets report in the city, the FTSE 100 closed down 3 points at 73.0. The pound buys $1.35 and €1.17. LBC weather, wet and windy in northern western parts of the UK this evening. Mild for many and mostly dry elsewhere, a low of 9 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Lucinda Horsley.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening. It's Monday's edition of Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. Coming up, we are going to be talking about all sorts of different subjects, but it rather depends on you what they might be. You might like to phone us on 0345 6060 973. You can watch us also on Global Player or the LBC website at lbc.co.uk and the LBC Facebook and YouTube channels. Let me introduce my panel to you. Today we have Sarah Olney with us, Liberal Democrat MP for Richmond Park. Now, she is not in the studio with us because there are apparently important votes going on, so we may lose her for a few minutes during the course of the hour, but let's hope not. We have John O'Connell, who's director of the Taxpayers Alliance. Ellie Mae O'Hagan is director of the Class think tank, and a third think tanker making her debut on the show. It's Francesca Fraser from the Onward think tank. She's a senior researcher there. So they're here to answer your questions. 0345 6060 973.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first questioner. It's Chris in Croydon. Hello, Chris.
Well, good evening, Iain.
What's your question, please, Chris?
Yes, my question is this. For the panel, which is more dishonourable, sleaze or seeking to negate the Brexit referendum?
That's quite an interesting one. Sarah Olney, let's come to you first on that.
Hi, Iain. Thanks very much for having me. That's, as you say, an interesting question, and I haven't had the two things contrasted in quite that same way. I think obviously what we've been talking about today in the Commons is, for want of a better word, sleaze. We've been specifically talking about standards, about how elected MPs behave and how they use their position, and about being honest and open and doing their very best to avoid conflicts of interest and ensuring that they maintain the standards that have been set down for them by cross-party, committees and so on. I think it's really, really important that when we, that we can trust the people who've been elected to represent constituents, that we can have confidence in their judgment, in their, and certainly according to their own, when they're assessing themselves and their own actions, as it were. So that's why I think it's been really, really important that we look at what happened last week with Owen Paterson, that we see it for what it was. He was absolutely found guilty of breaching the standards by the Standards Committee. There's no doubt that he was lobbying and he was taking money to lobby, and that is an unacceptable breach of standards. The government have attempted to kind of undermine that, or to try and make some case that he should not be judged harshly for doing that. I'm not entirely certain what they were trying to achieve, but the MPs of today have all come out very strongly and said, no, there need to be standards, we need to be held accountable, and we want to make sure that there is a robust process. I think obviously what the caller is referring to is the long process we've had for in the last 5 years about following the referendum. And I think all I would say with that is, certainly for myself, what I was campaigning for was a further vote, so that we're very clear about the terms on which the government were proposing to leave the European Union, that we could have a further vote on that, that we were asking the government to come to the table with exactly what its plans were, and to be really, really clear with the British public what they wanted to put in place if we were leaving the European Union. They failed to do that, and we're still living with the consequences.
That's slightly rewriting history, isn't it? Because you were campaigning. You were campaigning under the slogan "Bollocks to Brexit," and you and your colleagues did everything that you could in Parliament to thwart Brexit. Why not just be honest and admit that?
We were not doing everything we could to thwart Brexit. As I say, to begin with, we were certainly what we were campaigning for was a further vote on the terms, because it was never clear. There was all sorts of things claimed during the referendum campaign, which have, as you know, have not come to fruition. We don't have an extra 350 million for the NHS. We don't have German car makers queuing up to do a deal, or any of those other things we were promised. And what we wanted the government to do was to say, well, what exactly are you planning to deliver? And they never did. Certainly on the 2019 general election, we said that if we were in power, we would revoke Article 50. But again, there would have been a democratic vote. And if that's what the British people had voted for, we would have had a democratic mandate to implement it.
How many seats did you get? Just remind us.
We got 11, but we now have 12 because we had a marvellous by-election victory in Cheshire and Amersham earlier this year.
That worked well then. John O'Connell.
Really interesting question to sort of pitch the two against.
Let's just repeat it, because I know people join us a bit late sometimes. Which is more dishonourable, sleaze or seeking to negate the Brexit vote?
Well, I do think that there was 5 years of some quite underhand stuff in order to subvert quite a democratic vote to leave the European Union. I mean, Sarah did talk about some stuff about 350 million for the NHS, and that never came to pass. But what also never came to pass...
Well, it has actually come to pass. 394 million for the NHS. That's what Theresa May's government announced, but hey.
Maybe the precise figure never did, but, I also remember the Remain campaign talking about each household will be £4,300 worse off as a result of the vote. That never happened. I also remember 3 million jobs being gone as a result of the vote. That never happened. So both sides need to look at themselves on that one. But, what happened in Parliament over the last few days is pretty shameful, really. We did see a cross-party committee come to a decision that ought to have been sort of the end of the matter. And then the sort of shameful, attempt to change the rules after the fact was, unedifying. I started at the Taxpayers Alliance in 2009, and I well remember the MP's expenses scandal. And you had this sense that politicians were giving one another a green light to, act without the spirit of the law, even if they were technically within the letter of the law. So I do think that that's quite a shameful episode. Pick one. I mean, they're both pretty dishonourable in my book.
Ellie.
Well, I actually understand where Chris is coming from, your caller, Chris, on this, because, I'm going to lay my cards on the table. I voted Remain, but I did think that Leave won, and so I understand why people like Chris, who I presume voted Leave, would be frustrated by what happened in the 5 years after that, because, when you vote for something and you win, it should happen. So I understand that. But I think for me, definitely the answer has to be what's going on in Parliament at the moment, because, I do agree that what would have happened if the Remainers had got their way is that there would have been another vote. And I honestly think that if there had been another vote, another referendum, I think Leave would have won again. So I don't think the Remain campaign made a compelling argument in that 5 years about why we should stay in the EU. And I actually would say that's probably why this government won in 2019, because they promised to get Brexit done. So that is, I'm not saying that it was perfect. I think there were a lot of issues on all sides about the way that went down. And we've talked about that a lot over the last 5 years as a nation. But there was some element of democracy in there. And I think what you're seeing at the moment is a lot of power being concentrated in too few hands. So you're seeing someone like Owen Paterson, who is looking after the interests of a couple of private companies instead of the people that he's expected to represent, who's refusing to be accountable. And the government
He would probably say in addition to.
I'm sorry?
He would probably say in addition to the people.
He would say that. I would refute that, but you are correct that he would say that. And I think, you had the worldwide anti-corruption watchdogs saying what's happening at the moment in Britain is really dangerous. And I think that far surpasses anything that happened in the last 5 years with Brexit. And, and I think one thing I would say to Chris and all of your viewers, and I think it's really important for us to remember, is that what's happening at the moment with the government trying to do away with its own standards on corruption and with what's been going on with Owen Paterson, this is not normal behaviour for a democracy. And I think it's really important to say that, because I don't think that we should just allow this to become part of our political process. This should not be part of our expectations of MPs. We actually need to hold them to a higher standard than this, So that's why, for me, it is much worse.
If you ignore the fact of what the government did, and I think everyone agrees that it backfired on them, but actually, isn't the system working? With what the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner found, they issued a report, and it was supposed to come to Parliament to be voted on. But, I mean, it's not as if we get one of these cases every week coming forward. I mean, this was, one hopes, a one-off. Or do you think that there is an endemic corruption in the system? Because at the moment, I mean, all MPs who have, and I'm not defending them, I have some quite strong views on the other side of this, but MPs who have consultancies or business interests, they all have to declare them. We can all see how much time they spend on these consultancies and how much they get. And in the end, if their constituents don't like it, they can vote them out.
So I would say two things in response to that. I think the first thing that I would say is that I don't really see it as a system working where the Prime Minister attempts to do away with parliamentary standards and then U-turns at the last minute because of public outrage. I think a system that works is where that doesn't happen in the first place. So that's the first thing that I would say. And the second thing that I would say is, the Yorkshire Post in the last week published a list of the 16 most well-remunerated MPs from their second jobs. And only a small handful of those, I think it was about 4 of those, were engaged in jobs that you might be able to say were for the public good. So one was a lawyer, for example. I can't remember all the rest. I think so someone like Rosina Allen Khan. She's not one of the most well earning, but she earned money that she declared from being a doctor during the pandemic. I don't think anybody would have a problem with that. I think that was pretty noble. But the rest of the MPs who were earning, huge sums of money were working for organisations like JP Morgan or oil companies, or asset management companies. And I think, we all know how the world works,
Is that a crime?
Well, I think maybe it should be, and maybe we'll talk about that. But I think one thing we can all agree, right, is that whoever pays the piper picks the tune. I think that's one of the universal laws of life when you live in, a society that relies on money. And I think we need to be asking ourselves, who do these MPs work for? Do they work for the people who are paying them 6-figure salaries, or do they work for the public?
The thing is, we know who they work for because they declare who they work for, whereas 30 years ago, that wasn't always the case. Anyway, I need to move on to Francesca. Pretty unedifying the last week, but I mean, going back to the caller's question, which is more dishonourable, sleaze or seeking to negate the Brexit vote? What's your answer to that?
So I think both of these things have something in common, and that they're questioning what's in the public interest. The question of negating the Brexit vote, I would agree with Ellie, we need to respect that decision. But when it comes to this so-called sleaze, what we need to think about is, again, what do the public want? And the difficulty with the Owen Paterson case is he felt what he was doing was in the public interest. He's been quite upfront about that. He felt his acts during the pandemic were very matched what would be best in that case. But there's quite strong agreement that that's probably not the case. And to Ellie's point about these sort of multiple jobs, I think it comes back to the same question. There are some jobs that MPs do that undeniably enrich Parliament. They provide expertise, and it makes Parliament better off as a result. And examples like work in the NHS, or potentially being a lawyer or a teacher, all these things are good things, or councillors like Ben Bradley, for example. But the risk is with these sort of more consultancy roles that are slightly more blurred, is that really their role in a consultancy is to share insights in how Parliament works, and likely how policy making works. And so the very nature of that role, whilst in some cases it might be in the public interest to do that, the line is much more blurred. And so I think I'd potentially side with, there was reports of the Speaker over the weekend, but putting this back to the House, and saying that we need to be clearer on what the public will want and what that is. And if there is a blurred line of whether this is something that the public would want or whether it's not, then we should be clear on that and remove that from the options available, even if it is a case of declaring it.
Even though I described the events of the last week as fairly unedifying, you could make an argument to say, well, actually, the system has worked. The government tried to accrue more powers for itself, or tried to undermine some of the powers of Parliament. Parliament has hit back in no uncertain terms, and the government knows now that it won't be able to get away with it.
So I agree. I think to some extent it has worked. It's reached a conclusion that most people seem to felt is the right one, that he was not acting with proper conduct, and it seems actually quite a few of the people that voted for the amendment actually feel that way now. But it still remains the case that a lot of MPs from across the House feel like the current system isn't necessarily delivering for them. That's not necessarily to say what was proposed was the right option, and definitely not the way it was. It seemed like it wasn't really thought through. It didn't have support from across the floor, and that definitely ended up really being a problem. But it's not to say we can't review it, but it needs to be done in such a way that has cross-party support and makes the system better as a result.
Thank you very much. Lots of calls coming in on this, but if you want to ask a question on another subject that's either in the news, or you might have a moral or ethical question, perish the thought, that you might like to ask our panel as well. 034, they're all looking frightened now. 0345 6060 973. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
+8 on LBC, 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask a question over the next 45 minutes or so. Sarah Olney is here, Lib Dem MP for Richmond Park, John O'Connell from the Taxpayers Alliance, Ellie Mae O'Hagan from the Class think tank, and Francesca Fraser from the Onward think tank. It's a very think tanky programme. I don't know, Sarah, have you ever worked for a think tank?
No, I was an accountant before I became a politician. So,
so many jokes come to mind, but I'll keep them to myself. Right, let's go to our next caller. It's a question from Douglas in Westeros. Actually, it's a text question. Does the panel agree that Boris Johnson was avoiding scrutiny today and has attempted to make Stephen Barclay, the Cabinet Office Minister, a scapegoat? Well, this is, of course, the debate that was going on in the Commons on MPs' outside interests. Boris Johnson was on a visit to a hospital in the northeast. He did get back at 20 to 5. Somebody pictured him at King's Cross Station, but didn't make an appearance in the Commons. And instead of Jacob Rees-Mogg, who would normally be expected to lead this kind of a debate for the government as the leader of the House of Commons, it was the Cabinet Office Minister, Stephen Barclay. John, let's come to you first. Boris Johnson has a habit of going missing in action on these occasions, doesn't he?
Yeah, there was another time when he was expected at a debate and took a trip to Afghanistan.
I think it was a Heathrow third runway, wasn't it?
Third runway, that was exactly it. Yeah, so he's clocked up a fair bit of air miles, not turning up for the debates at which he might be expected to. I don't know who is to blame for this, right? I don't know whether it's Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, or somebody else entirely. So to try and pin it on somebody, I simply don't have the answer. But it seems quite obvious that he wasn't there in order to avoid some quite tricky questions. But that quite often happens. You see it on media broadcast rounds. They send out the so-called safe pair of hands. I think over the course of the pandemic, they worked out that Grant Shapps happened to be that safe pair of hands, and they used to send him out. Will that register with people? I'm not entirely sure. But
Francesca, this is a little different though, isn't it? Because a lot of Conservative MPs are very angry about what happened last week because, as I said an hour ago, he marched them up to the top of the hill and then abandoned them there, didn't even bother to march them down again. And I think they might quite like to have seen the Prime Minister in the Commons, at least offering some sort of contrition, but he doesn't really do that, does he?
Yeah, so what I would say is Steve Barclay actually spoke very, very well at the House today. Boris Johnson's calendar and timetables are things that I don't know much about, and I'm sure nor do you either, but I know it's quite difficult to arrange these things, and I don't know what the details
No, but what I do know is if there's an important parliamentary debate, that usually takes precedence over any other things that the Prime Minister has in their diary. Margaret Thatcher, John Major, Tony Blair, I think, all of them would have appeared in front of the Commons today in a similar situation.
Yeah, no, so totally, I agree with you. But I would say the main thing is that they've accepted this was a mistake. There's been a lot of criticism for a number of U-turns, and in this occasion, I think it was right that they did a U-turn. And I think actually the main thing was that someone who represented the government, Steve Barclay, is Minister for the Cabinet Office, is a relevant role, came forward and did apologise quite eloquently and sincerely to the House. And so whilst I do appreciate this sentiment that if you sort of whip your MPs to vote one way and you ask them to go out, I think the description over the weekend was without armour, that they are due an apology. But they did get that, and they did get that from Steve Barclay. So I appreciate it, but I'm not sure how much it matters.
Ellie.
Well, I mean, this is the man who hid in a fridge during the election campaign to avoid questions. So, yes, I do think that he put Stephen Barclay up to avoid scrutiny. And, yeah, I agree that this is something that he's done before. And I just think, Boris Johnson is the kind of guy who, you'll go out on a night out with him, you'll spend loads of money on expensive champagne until it's time to pay the bill, and then suddenly he's nowhere to be seen. He's that
kind of guy. You sounded like Amber Rudd. She made that joke, didn't she?
Well, yeah, I mean, and I think she's, I don't agree with Amber Rudd on a lot of things, but I think she nailed him there. That is what he's like. And there's not really much more to say to it than that, other than, is this the kind of person who's fit to be Prime Minister, really?
John, do you think the shine is coming off Boris Johnson a bit? If you look at his personal opinion poll ratings, even among Conservative voters, they're pretty low at the moment. And there's a real opportunity for the Labour Party here, if only they could work out how to put the ball in the net.
Perhaps a strong opposition is always a good thing. Whether it's been strong over the last couple of years, I was going to say it's debatable. It's probably not debatable. It's not been particularly strong at all. Obviously from our perspective, we'd like to see an opposition talking about wasteful spending, value for money, taxes are going up, this kind of thing. So there are areas in which the Labour Party could be saying some things to sort of woo, I suppose, traditional small C Conservative voters. I don't know, in the wider public, is Boris still the guy that delivered Brexit? Is he still somebody that, exudes this optimism? Perhaps. And there's a lot of MPs, of course, who probably feel that, Boris helped them win their seat in perhaps some very difficult places to win an election for a Conservative MP. So I don't know whether his support's waning at all in the parliamentary party or even in the polling, but, I would love to see a much stronger opposition giving some back, absolutely.
Well, we might have a question on that later, you never know. 0345 6060 973. Christine, if you think I've empty-chaired Sarah Olney, by the way, I haven't. She's had to go and vote, but she's doing her democratic duty, but she will be back shortly. Christine in Slough has another question. Christine, hi, what would you like to ask?
Hi, Ian. Yes, I'd like to ask, where in the contract of employment or in the job description of an MP does it say an MP is allowed to have a second job? Like, for example, if I was a nurse, I'd work as a nurse. If I tried to do anything other than working as a nurse, it's known as moonlighting, and I'd be sacked on the spot. When you're serving your constituents, and the constituents depend on you and they actually, trust you, I think this situation where they were putting in cash for questions and making money on top of it is criminal and is really dishonest and corrupt. It's no other word for it. And I don't know why people keep saying, the other opposition and the opposition. The opposition has no chance because you've got a huge lead. So whatever happens, the Tories keep on lying and they put it to a vote and they win because they've got a majority. There's nothing to do with the opposition. The opposition holds them to account, and that is why we are now.
Well, two points of clarification there. Cash for questions was in 1997. I don't think there are any allegations here that Owen Paterson put down cash for questions, so you need to be quite accurate in the way you describe these things. And second of all, MPs don't have contracts of employment. If there is a contract of employment, it's between the MPs and their constituents. There's no formal contract of employment. And traditionally, in olden days, MPs they did do part-time work. I mean, essentially, the mornings they went off and did a lot of them were lawyers, a lot of them ran businesses, and then in the afternoon they would come into the Commons to vote and legislate. That's how it used to be, but there's a bit of an overhang from that. Francesca, essentially the question is, why is it acceptable for MPs to have second jobs when it would be illegal to have one for everyone else?
So I don't think, it's not really illegal for other people to have second jobs providing, it depends on their contracts, but providing they're fulfilling what they're asked for in their contract and they're not competing against it, then that isn't something that's illegal. But I'd probably return to my point that I said earlier, that actually if their second job is a role they're doing that is beneficial to the work they're doing, important work like working in the NHS, then I don't think it should be a problem. We know that lots of MPs participate in APPGs. Some participate in handfuls of them. Some only participate in one. They choose to use their time differently, and I think that's okay. And it's important that they have that autonomy to do that. And so I don't think it's necessarily a problem to that extent. It's about how they're using that time and whether they're doing so in a transparent and accountable way that's honest to the constituents that elected them, and doing so in a way that is delivering for what they want and delivering for their constituents. And if they're using other time to do other jobs, I broadly think that's okay.
Ellie, if someone was, chairman of a company that had a plant in the constituency, that company was creating jobs, it was creating wealth within the constituency. Can you not equate that with an MP working as a doctor in a hospital? Surely it's still a good thing for an MP to do.
No, I think the general principle has to be no second jobs. That has to be the thing that we lead with, no second jobs, because there are all these hypotheticals that we can talk about. What if this? What if that? But actually, the reality is that most MPs who are benefiting the most from second jobs are doing these lucrative, private consultancy gigs. So, you've got one MP, and I'm embarrassed, I can't remember his name, who earned £150,000 in 3 years from an oil company who then said that climate activists are the same as radical Islamists. Now, that was only in May this year that he said that. And now we're sort of, in the middle of the most important conference in the world to do with climate. So that's clearly not for the benefit of people. And that's actually the reality of what's going on in most second jobs. The second jobs that earn the most money are about helping banks, helping oil companies, helping mining companies. They're not actually about, helping constituents, helping the health service. So I think the principle has to be no second jobs, because it's very easy then that you get a nice consultancy gig in return for political access. So no second jobs, because I do think that's corrosive for democracy. But we can have exceptions. So, for example, like Christine, who I really appreciated her Vim, by the way. I enjoyed that nice peppy call. I like angry callers. I think it's good to be angry. But yeah, and I don't mean that in a patronising way. I really mean it. Like, if we're not angry about this stuff, then we accept it, and you should never accept things that are wrong. But yeah, I think, she was using the example of nursing. So obviously, if Christine was to become an MP, maybe she couldn't be a practicing nurse. But obviously, I think there would be no harm in her staying a registered nurse. So, there can be exceptions here and there. But I think the leading principle has to be no second jobs, because I
think there were a couple of MPs during COVID who were nurses, and they went back and helped out in their own local hospitals.
Yeah, so Rosina Allen Khan, who was a doctor who went and worked back in a hospital, and Nadia Whittam went back and did care work. That's 2 examples. So obviously, no one would have a problem with that. But I think the general principle has to be no second jobs, because the possibility of second jobs being exploited by wealthy people and companies to gain political access, the risk of that is too high.
Okay, right, we're going to get the answers from Sarah and John after the news. It's 8:32 on LBC. Let's get the headlines from Lucinda Horsley.
MPs have been told to tune down party political sniping as they debate how they're held to account. The Speaker has criticised the fallout of a report finding Conservative Owen Paterson broke lobbying rules. He's since resigned. A man who fell while exploring a cave in the Brecon Beacons on Saturday has been rescued and taken to hospital. Officials say he was brought out around 7:45 this evening following a 54-hour ordeal. Barack Obama's told young climate activists to channel their frustration and prepare for a marathon. The former US president spoken at COP26 in Glasgow, saying the world's nowhere near where it should be in the fight against climate change. LBC weather, wet and windy in northern and western parts of the UK this evening, especially in Scotland, mostly dry elsewhere, a low of 9 degrees.
This is LBC.
6, delighted that Sarah Olney is back with us from doing her democratic duty. She is the Liberal Democrat MP for Richmond Park. John O'Connell is from the Taxpayers Alliance. Ellie Mae O'Hagan from the Class think tank. Or is it Class?
Well, I say class.
Do you?
But class is allowed.
Good. And Francesca Fraser is from the Onward think tank as well. Right, we were in the middle of answering a question from Christine in Slough, which I'll repeat for the benefit of Sarah. Why is it acceptable for MPs to have second jobs when it would be illegal to have one for everyone else? Sarah?
Well, I don't think it is illegal for anyone else to have a second job. There are plenty of people who do lots of different things. Obviously, it depends on the terms of your particular contract and how many hours you're contracted for and so on. And I think that is possibly one of the grey areas for MPs, is we don't have employment contracts. We are returned by our electors to be their representative in Parliament. And there really are very few restrictions, actually, on MPs, which has obviously given rise to all sorts of problems, as we've seen, not just with the standards debate, but lots of other things. I think it's certainly moving more towards the point over the last few years where it's expected that MPs will treat their work in Parliament and in the constituency as if it is a full-time job. But that, funnily enough, historically, that's not always been the case. I don't mean to kind of get unnecessarily technical, but as I say, it's always been allowed. And I think I heard the end of Ellie Mae's response there. There are some really good examples where people maintaining their professional qualifications, for example, and to do that, you need to be doing a certain number of hours on the wards or whatever if you're a nurse. And I think, to be honest, no MP should expect to keep their job forever. We all of us should be acting as if, the next general election will see us back out on the streets. And for those of us who've built up professional qualifications or professional experience, I don't necessarily think that there would be a problem in occasionally spending time maintaining that.
I mean, you've got experience of that, haven't you? Because being an MP is a precarious job, unless you're in a very, very safe seat. And for Liberal Democrats, that isn't always the case, shall we say.
Yes.
And you did get turfed out once, and you then either had to go back to your old profession or find something else to do. And there's this old saying that there's nothing so ex as an ex-MP. And I'm not saying that people should sort of pull their onions out of their pockets and feel deep sympathy, but it isn't a job for life for most MPs, is it?
And none of us should be treating it as such. And I think there's lots of chat about how MPs should have real life experience, real world experience before they come into Parliament, which I absolutely think is right. And if people have built up lots of interesting skills and experience in a different profession, then I don't think it should necessarily be a problem that they try and maintain that while they're in Parliament. I think the one thing that is really, really important is that mustn't influence their work in Parliament. They've got to be really open about the fact, especially if they're drawing a salary, and I'm not always talking about people drawing a salary necessarily, and they've just got to be really, really clear about what it is they're doing and who they're doing it for, and just to make absolutely certain that it's all transparent and crystal clear, and that's what Owen Paterson failed to do.
John, very briefly, if you can.
Second jobs, no problem with them. I think the system in place of max transparency is the right one to make sure that people can see who's doing what and how many hours and how much money is being received for doing so. I think that the people that get to decide whether that's acceptable or not are the constituents themselves. That's why there's right of recall of certain breaches are made by MPs. And I also think it's quite dangerous if we, who will decide what is a good and a bad job? Which job is okay and which job is not okay?
Well, according to Richard Bergen, who's putting forward a bill, he says the Standards Committee would decide that on the presumption that they should always say no unless there's a good reason not to.
Right, but then the employment market changes so much that politicians will be light years behind the employment market, and there'll be all these different types of jobs that people will be in a bind about whether it's good or bad. A system of max transparency is the right one, and you sort of touched on this earlier where you said actually it wasn't the system that was at fault here, it was the subsequent attempt to unpick the system that was the problem. So the system did a reasonable job of cross-party sort of decision to say that Owen Paterson had broken the rules. The problem was afterwards, and I think max transparency is the right way forward.
Well, we're going to be talking much more about this after 9 o'clock, if you'd like to put your viewpoint forward. Christine, thank you for that. That's Christine in Slough. Next caller on a completely different subject, it's Kevin in Hampstead. Hello, Kevin.
Yes, hi there. Yeah, great to have a conversation. I'd like to ask your guest, do they actually think that Keir Starmer will lead Labour into the next election, or will he be replaced?
Ellie?
I think he will lead Labour into the next election, because I think if we learned one thing about Labour leaders from Jeremy Corbyn's tenure is that they're very hard to replace. So I think, yes, he will lead Labour into the next election. And I suppose what Kevin is maybe hinting towards, but not saying, is that there have been some problems with Keir Starmer's leadership. And I would agree with that. And for me, I think his main problem is that he just doesn't seem to have found a foothold in holding this government to account, in criticising this government. And I think he's been so afraid of appearing too political that he's sort of fallen down when it comes to actually communicating what Labour would do differently and what the Labour Party under his leadership stands for. And I think, Labour has sort of made some a bit better inroads with that recently. So, for example, there's now clear blue water between the Conservatives and the Labour Party in terms of what both parties would do about climate change, which I think is really welcome. And, I think Angela Rayner has done some very good things around the rights of workers. I think some of the things that Rachel Reeves has announced has been really good. But, I mean, I don't want to presume on what Kevin was hinting at, because, he didn't say, but if the implication was that there have been some elements of Keir Starmer's leadership that is lacking, I would agree with that. And is it a good thing that Keir Starmer leads Labour into the next election? I always think, there's a Charles Bukowski quote, which I'm not going to repeat verbatim because it has some swear words in it. But what he basically says is, if you're going to destroy something, you better have something better to replace it with. And I think at the moment it's not quite clear who would replace Keir Starmer. And so until that becomes clear, I think that, working with Keir Starmer is important. But maybe other people on the left would disagree with me there.
Sarah, the Liberal Democrats have got quite some experience of ditching leaders and replacing them. What advice would you give to the Labour Party here? And do you think that his question is, do the panel think that Keir Starmer can actually lead Labour into the next election? Do you?
I expect he probably will, simply because the time between now and the next general election might be shorter than any of us think, and it's we need to be ready. I think this is obviously not my party that I'm talking about, although I very much would like to see a not Tory government at the next election. So it concerns me, shall we say? I think with Labour, they've got more problems than just the leader. And I think it's I don't know if they can turn things around just from a change of leader. I think they've got there's a lot of infighting going on in Labour, a lot of factionalism. They've got financial problems. I think they depended for a long time on block voting, if you like, by trade union membership. And that's sort of pretty much disintegrated over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. I think they've got an awful lot to do to kind of patch things up internally, to put their finances in order, and to really work out what their pitch is, which voters they want to attract, how they're going to get back into the red wall. I think it starts with the leader. I think Keir Starmer could be doing an awful lot more, but I don't think it's just the leader. I think they've got a lot more that they need to do. But honestly, I wish them well. I really, really do want Labour to be challenging the government much more successfully than they are.
John, I've written about Keir Starmer in the Telegraph tomorrow, and I've likened him to Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. I don't know if you're a football fan, but I think there are parallels to be drawn there, where they've both been given votes of confidence by their respective boards, but they maybe have lost the dressing room a bit. Do you think that position is recoverable? Don't bother with Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, but with Keir Starmer?
Well, that stings me a bit because I'm a Spurs fan, and Man United's one little return to form was obviously when they killed us 3-0 at the Lane. But to answer the question directly, yes, he probably will lead them into the next election. Has he lost the confidence of the board? I'm not so sure. I do agree with Sarah that I do think he needs to find a compelling idea of what it is he wants Labour to be, who he wants it to speak to. I do feel that Labour sometimes can be, trying to be all things to all people and all different factions of their party. And if he is to sort of recapture areas of the North and the Midlands that were lost in 2019, there are some bread and butter issues that the Labour Party, in my opinion, ought to focus on. You know, people do care about what's happening locally. They care about their bins. They care about potholes. They care about value for money. They care about these things. And, you know, I think that there's a bit of too much of a please everyone kind of approach at the minute, and it's not working. A bit like Ollie, actually. But
okay. Francesca.
I really like your comparison. I actually think it's a bit unfair. I think Ole Gunnar Solskjaer has sort of run out of ideas, and I don't think Keir Starmer necessarily has, but we're yet to see some of them. I think that the Labour Party is still yet to really assert what they stand for in their new era. Keir Starmer's speech at Labour Party conference, I actually think, was quite a good step in that direction. He started to set out a bit of an agenda, particularly around sort of integrity and honesty and that sort of thing. But no doubt there's more that needs to be done. I think he probably will be leader at the next election. And I think that's probably a good thing if they can continue on the path they're on. But they need to create a clearer sense of what that means, particularly in sort of finding a voice and delivering for the voters that they lost in the north of England, and particularly on some of these sort of bread and butter issues, things like crime and welfare, the things that voters really, really care about. And in a slightly bizarre way, the Conservatives have ended up being seen as the trusted voice in some of these issues that they haven't traditionally been. And so if Keir Starmer really is to become a strong candidate for the next election, then he will need to get a grip of some of these issues and decide what they think.
Kevin, quickly to you, do you think he'll lead Labour into the next election?
I don't for 1 second. I could be quoted on that, but it's all fair comment from your panel there. I think that the most one that touched me was the guy that said that he's trying to please all the people all the time, and that doesn't really work in politics. So I don't see him leading the Labour into the next election, but I can be quoted on that, and I look forward to it. Thank you very much.
We'll quote you then. I think all political parties aim to please all of the people all of the time, don't they? That's kind of goes with the territory. Right, we'll take more of your calls in a moment. It's 8:48.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Weekday mornings from 7.
Conservative MP and International Trade Secretary Anne-Marie Trevelyan. Will the government be accepting any proposal which would bar an MP from taking a role as a paid consultant?
I think the richness that comes from colleagues having second jobs
yes, £500,000 is pretty rich.
Personally, I think if there's a lobbying role, my view is that isn't necessarily the right way forwards, but I wouldn't want to see second jobs stopped. Some of the doctors and nurses who've continued to do shifts through COVID have brought an incredible sharp-end information to the House of Commons to help ministers make decisions.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC.
Hey,
52, nice weighty text here from Sheena in York. How optimistic or realistic should we be when it comes to COP26? Francesca.
It's a really good question, Sheena. I think actually increasingly more optimistic. About a week ago, entering into COP26, the mood was quite downbeat, particularly around the news that Xi Jinping wouldn't be attending and these sort of things. And I guess it's possible that was a slight strategy to sort of set the bar low and then be able to deliver. But there have been some quite constructive outcomes that have come from it, particularly sort of India's commitment around net zero by 2070. And I know some people will say that's too far away, but it's a step in the right direction. And they've also made commitments around 2030 and renewable energy. So I think we should be optimistic. More needs to be done. The challenge will really be making sure that people stick to these promises. We had 1.5 degrees a while ago, and the message this time seems to be let's keep 1.5 alive. And so it will be how we make sure all governments follow through on these promises and support the sort of less developed countries to do so as well. For example, the moves on deforestation were good, and they were accompanied by, I think it was $20 billion worth of financing to help these developed nations reach that as well. So I'm increasingly optimistic, but the sort of time will tell as to how closely people stick to it.
John?
Well, it depends what we mean by optimistic as well, I suppose, because I'm all for going green, but I don't want to do so on the backs of the poorest households through higher bills, more green taxes, etc., and leaving things like travel and things like that at the preserve of the rich, and you create a two-tier society. I think that progress over the last however many years, it's not everything's all that bad, and I think that the push to go green is okay. It's fine as long as it's not done on the backs of the poorest household. If we're talking about, for example, replacing gas boilers with heat pumps, if you replace the 450,000 that are needed by 2025, that's $2.25 billion. These numbers are just chucked around as if they're small change. They've got to be paid by somebody somehow. So some broader conversations about how that money is actually raised, who pays the bills. I think we need much more honesty in that area.
Sarah?
I thought there was some really good stuff coming out of COP. Francesca was saying there about deforestation, and I think personally that's something that was really encouraging. I think because there's been quite a lot of talk recently about, we just need to innovate, we need to just come up with new ways of doing things. But I think the actual focus on some of these, actually some of the things that we really need to stop doing to our natural environment, forests and rainforests in particular are carbon sinks. There are natural, solutions to climate change. And so to actually focus on some of the behaviour change we need to see and an actual change to the way that we the way we kind of prioritise economic activity, I think that's a signal of the sorts of things that we really need to see. So I found that very encouraging. But I do think there's a lot more that needs to be done. We really need to get China on board in particular, because they at the moment are kind of such a significant global trading partner, and Russia as well, who've got such a large role to play in the world's sort of energy supplies. If we're going to decarbonise energy supplies in particular, we really do need to get more commitment from Russia and China. So it's frustrating that there wasn't more of an opportunity to do that. But so I think with most, as with most things, a bit of a mixture of good and bad, but at least the conversations are being had, at least it's on the agenda. And I feel like at least a lot of particularly young people got the opportunity to really say to politicians, this matters so much. We really do need it to stay at the top of the agenda and to really see some action.
Ellie?
Well, on the one hand, it's a very serious situation. We are sort of 1 minute to midnight now, really, when it comes to solving climate change. So it is a very serious situation. But I actually do feel very optimistic about it, because I think it wasn't so long ago that we were really looking at quite catastrophic scenarios. And I think what has changed, the reason why we're getting to this place now where countries are making these pledges and are making these announcements, is because of people power, is because people have come out in their millions across the world. There were 300 demonstrations across the world on Saturday. I went to the one in London, of people demanding action. It was activists in this country that single-handedly really stopped fracking from being a lucrative exercise in this country. So I think that the public are paying attention. I think that people are willing to go out onto the streets and demand change. And I don't have faith in our leaders to fix this issue if we just leave them to their own devices. But I do have faith in the people of this country and people across the world to hold their leaders to account and to demand better for future generations. And I think that's what's going to create the change, and that's what I feel optimistic about.
Right. Let's finish off with a text question from Lucy in Crouch End. No, actually, we're going to do one with Jason in Leeds. Me and the family are delighted the US has opened back up in Florida. Here we come. Go on, panel. Tell us your favourite American state. That seems everyone's actually been to the United States. Francesca, what's your favourite American state?
Oh, it's a really good question. I have been to America twice, but I haven't spent that much time there. I would probably say California, and being in the sun on that state would be my favourite. But I'm delighted they've opened up the borders. It's a really important move.
Ellie?
Well, I mean, I would pick California because my grandmother actually emigrated to California and she lived there until she died. So it's close to my heart. But I would say because that's already been mentioned, I probably would say I went to North Carolina in 2016, and it's just got a beautiful temperate southern climate. People are incredibly welcoming, and the barbecue food is just delicious. So I would definitely recommend a visit to North Carolina.
John?
I was going to say Nevada, strictly for Las Vegas and how insane that place is. But maybe Massachusetts. I've got Irish family and good connections in Boston and that kind of thing. So probably Massachusetts just on that basis.
Sarah?
Gosh, I've only been to the States twice, and both times just to New York. So, but honestly, it was phenomenal. I absolutely loved it. It was some years ago now, quite a bit younger, but I was blown away by New York, and I'd go back anytime.
Well, I'm going to throw Colorado into the mix. Denver, I think, is a fantastic city, and you've got all those ski slopes nearby, so that would be my choice. Thank you very much indeed, Sarah Olney, John O'Connell, Ellie Mae O'Hagan and Francesca Fraser. We have another cross question for you tomorrow at 8, believe it or not. Oh, how we treat you. Coming up in a moment, we're going to be talking about MPs' interests again, because the House of Commons has been debating that today. I want to know whether you think MPs should be entitled to have second jobs. Is it a simple yes, no, or is it a bit more of a nuanced debate? 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Boris Johnson says he doesn't think there's much more to say on the Owen Paterson lobbying scandal as MPs debate the decision not to